Okay, let me know when I should start.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm just going to post in the Discord.
Okay.
Okay, I'll let a couple of people join so that we have a audience, and then we can get going. Okay, I'd say we're good to go then whenever you're ready.
Cool. So I should just say my thoughts, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi people. I don't know who actually is watching this, but I've been asked to share my thoughts on the motion. And I thought I should just start with a strong qualifier that this is so out of my comfort zone and so out of my expertise that it might actually end up sounding quite generic. I haven't really been reading up much about various parts of the world ever since I retired for good, unlike Sajid and Sher did. So I will just give some of my thoughts on what I thought or what considerations might have been if I was faced with such a motion. And obviously, I think given that debaters at this tournament will probably know a lot more or have read up a lot more about the Balkans in the lead up to Worlds, you guys can just sort of fill in kind of the strategic components with your own thoughts on the matter and your own information on the matter. So I'm just gonna go through a couple of like I guess thoughts that I had with regards to how I would approach the motion. The first obviously being on the issue of the word oppose. And this is actually a discussion that I've had with some people like fairly recently. So it's an interesting, I guess, it's an interesting coincidence. And the reason for that is because I think increasingly as debating becomes more technical, people have had more and more issue with things like the word oppose, regret, and actor motions, and what exactly these burdens are and what they entail. So, for instance, when you see a this house opposes motion, one of the questions that that some people have asked recently has been the idea that has been kind of like, is an opposed motion the same as a regrets motion? And what do Gov and Op teams have to do? Can they reasonably or do they have to define a counterfactual? And do they have to define an actor that is doing the opposition? Personally, I'm of the opinion, and how I generally approach motions is a motion that says this house oppose is a motion that doesn't dictate a retrospective perspective on the motion. So what this means then is that I generally believe, and I think the World's manual is arguably a bit unclear about this, but an opposed motion takes place in the here and now and moving forward into the future, which suggests that if you were to oppose something, you can't look back and remove all instances in which this particular narrative or this particular action has happened. It has to happen from the now moving forward. And so what this therefore means is that we would prefer a world, or an opposed motion suggests that we prefer a world in which this particular action, in this case, the teaching of the struggle against the Ottoman Empire, is removed or drastically reduced in Balkan history curriculum. So this doesn't take away from all of the times prior in which Balkan states have taught this in their national curriculum. And so any impacts or any practical applications of this needs to deal with how this is going to look like from now onwards. The next thing, oh, hi Geneva. Yeah, so with regards to that, I think that's kind of the idea of the timeline. And so then that leads to the second question, which is what exactly does the counterfactual, or is there a need for a counterfactual in these kinds of opposed motions? And honestly, I think that there is, and that's, I think, one thing that I find problematic when I'm judging motions that claim to oppose something. And the reason for that is because people tend to say, oh, we just need to oppose it. We need to show that, the absence of this is a good thing. But I think what many debaters tend to forget is that you can't just believe that the absence of something is good, because nothing is genuinely good unless you have something to compare it to, which therefore suggests that in the absence of something, a different alteration of a history curriculum will take its place. So in this case, what this suggests is that if you are saying that you oppose the teaching of, this struggle from history curriculums, you need to be able to also explain what you would have that would replace something that is a substantial portion of history curriculums right now. What are you going to focus on? How are you going to talk about it, etc. And I actually think that that's quite important, because I think in many debates, what would likely have happened, I don't know, judges will probably know and have their own frustrations about this, but I think what likely happened in many debates is that people just sort of talked about the pros and cons of the inclusion of these narratives in the history curriculum without actually assessing whether it would have become better or worse in a counterfactual, or what exactly would have taken its place and whether it's better or worse than that replacement. So I think just specifically with regards to how I would strategize in a motion like this, I would definitely have thought about, okay, what is the likely replacement, or what can I reasonably claim is a likely replacement for this struggle against the Ottoman Empire in history curriculums, and how do I think it will be taught? And do I think do I think that it's better or worse, depending on whether I'm in Gulf or Op? So I think that's the first general point that I want to make. The second thing that I will make, and the second generic point, again, given that I don't know much about the Balkans, that I would make about history curriculums, is about the philosophy behind the teaching of history. So again, whenever motions on how we should teach history come about, people tend to default towards saying, oh, we should just teach facts and not teach a biased view in one way or another, not villainize any person in the narrative, or not glorify anything that happened or any actors that were there in the narrative. And again, I think that this is probably a inaccurate way of approaching history curriculum motions. The reason for that is because when you are telling a story, inevitably, the way that you tell that story is colored by how you would like someone else to perceive that particular story. And this is just true regardless of how factual you try to be. And particularly so when it comes to history curriculums. Obviously, because no one and no curriculum can truly encompass the entirety of history, especially given that there are mixed legacies or many things that have happened in history. So the kind of information that you choose to select, the kind of circumstances that you choose to focus on, the kind of actors that you choose to sort of ruminate on and explain their actions, or even the way that you sort of explain causality, like the factors that led to a certain outcome, are all colored by a particular view of how history was really like. And so there's no such thing as a neutral teaching of history. History is always colored by a bias in one way or another. So in this case, I think it's actually essential that when arguing for a counterfactual or arguing about how we want to teach history, it's important to also take into account the actor's perspective and the actor's likely incentives when it comes to the teaching of the history. So for instance, if we're talking about Balkan states, and there are the Balkan states are obviously not homogeneous in any way. Each individual country likely has a different way of approaching an alternative curriculum and how they are likely going to express their views of an alternative curriculum. And I think those things are important aspects of how you would then craft your counterfactual, and how you will portray how these nations are going to replace the struggle against the Ottoman Empire as part of their history curriculum. I kind of hope that all of these things make sense so far, but the general point that I'm trying to make is that when talking about specifically things like history, but also I think to make it a bit broader, I guess, so that it's perhaps potentially applicable for future rounds, things like, for instance, anything that has to do with a subjective view, the way that you would express a media story, the way that you would teach, subjective lessons in the humanities, even like political science, for instance, are all things that necessarily are colored by the view that the author or the actor behind these narratives have on that particular issue, and therefore as a result can never actually just only be neutral or facts-based, or at the very least you leave yourself extremely vulnerable to an opposing team utilizing a more realistic view of how people teach and tell stories in order to explain why your facts-based view doesn't work. So yeah, the next two things that I'll just very quickly cover with regards to that, I guess, is what exactly is the power of a history curriculum when you are making certain arguments. And I think there are two things that need to be taken for granted when we're talking about the teaching of history curriculums in debate. The first is that I think it's impossible to say that a history curriculum can be divorced from current realities, because if it could, then there would be no incentive for states to manipulate the teaching of it. But it would also mean that there is no impact in a debate that comes from like teaching one thing or another. So for the debate to matter, for a motion to matter, history curriculums must have some sort of hangover effect on the way that the world is right now, whether it comes through things like self-identification, national identity, and crucially, as a part of that national identity, then how we would perceive other ethnicities or other people that are similar or different from us. And also comes from things like, self-identification, like how do you understand your own history, your own culture, and correspondingly then how does this play out in terms of relationships with like states that exist right now that are hangovers from those forms of like, past history. So for example, if you're talking about any form of post-colonial state, an antagonistic teaching of history about struggles specifically would very likely lead to an antagonistic relationship with the state as it is now, just because that is so ingrained into your national identity that these people owe a restitutive sort of duty to you on the basis of like oppressions that have happened in the past or colonialism that's happened in the past. You can say that the state now is divorced from the state as it was as an empire. And presumably in this case, I don't think that perhaps it's the most reasonable to say that people in the Balkans hate Turkey as a result of the curriculum that teaches them about Ottoman history. Again, many caveats, but I think very few people see Turkey as a direct counterpart to the Ottoman Empire. But I do think that it has implications on perhaps how they perceive, the concept of Islam, ethnicity, and other such issues as well. So I think for like just general post-colonial motions when it comes to history curriculums, that's an important thing to note. The last thing that I would say is about that's kind of general, and now I'll move or attempt to move into like I guess a little bit more specifics. The last thing I would then say about like impact is that if you are portraying struggle against a particular actor, you disallow or you displace the impact that those cultures have had on you. So in this case, what I'm trying to say is, in this case, if you portray specifically the idea of a struggle, which is to say, obviously, this is not a debate about not mentioning the Ottoman Empire at all. It's specifically a debate about emphasizing on the struggle against the Ottoman Empire. Arguing that you have struggled against an oppressor and have gained independence as a result of that struggle displaces the potential of you looking positively at the impacts of that oppressor in the future or moving forward into the future. And I guess this is where I kind of move a little bit more into substantive portions, which is to say, if you were to argue that you struggle against an Ottoman Empire, this clearly reinforces the concept that the Ottoman Empire and its implications on like, Balkan culture, etc., was a negative one, and you portray them as the other, which means that it's difficult then to see the hangovers of Ottoman culture within like, Balkan society as a positive thing, but also makes it extremely difficult to learn from like the positive aspects of like an Ottoman rule. And I'm obviously not saying that it was wholly good, but if you look at the way that the info slide is crafted, it quite specifically talks about things that, as far as my understanding of like the Ottoman Empire is concerned, is probably inaccurate. Again, I want to caveat, I don't know specifically about the history of the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, but I do know about the Ottoman Empire. And like with regards to the specific issues that were mentioned in the info slide, these are all things that were true, but largely overblown. So for instance, things like forced conversions were not the kind of forced conversions that people think about today, or when you see the word forced conversions, a lot of it from the Ottoman Empire, were things like, for example, a higher tax for non-Muslims, for instance, or like the whole stealing children for the Janissary was actually in like significant decline very, very early on. And like, I think less than 20,000 people were ever stolen to like Istanbul for like inclusion into the war. And many of them after that did have very high positions in the political sort of like hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, what the Ottoman Empire did do, things like, for example, the millet system, Tanzimat reforms, all of these were specific reforms that were targeted towards giving different religions or non-Muslims autonomy over how they govern their own areas. Obviously limited autonomy, but some measure of autonomy. And the Tanzimat reforms in particular, while it was obviously meant to sort of save a dying empire, also sort of like elevated the status of like non-Muslims to the same status as Muslims, or try as far as possible to allow for that to happen under the new political system. And so the point that I'm trying to make here is that there are obviously some good things that come from certain oppressive regimes, like for instance, the concept of religious tolerance, the concept of like even the probability that like there was like varying forms of autonomy that were given to different regions that allowed for different ethnicities to live together in a measure of like peace, with some measure of like unity and harmony, are all important considerations, and also present a very important sort of like guideline or framework as to how the region could be like, that I think are displaced and made impossible at the point at which you say that the struggle is something that we should emphasize on, that we ought to glorify. And again, like I think these are principles that are just generally sort of applicable to any sort of debate that chooses to paint a conflict in a black or white way, which is that like because things are just generally gray in real life, you just can't talk about the good things that existed. And I think that's bad. I think a second thing to sort of note is also that retrospective looks on a retrospective focus. I mean, obviously history curriculums are retrospective, but looking so far back into the past when there are obviously many more bigger issues that have happened in the interim, also means that it's very difficult for countries to have like a framework for moving forward. And what this obviously means is that yes, you can forge a national identity on the basis of antagonism against certain actors, but if that is the case, it disallows your country, because like this actor no longer exists. It disallows your country from knowing what to do moving forward. And so you're kind of mired in a retrospective view of the world. And that has like obvious implications to the way that society develops, the way that society chooses to conceptualize of the world. And so an alternative to this is arguably the concept of nation building. And like I think this is maybe a bit it's maybe a bit stereotypical that I talk about a history curriculum focused on nation building as a Singaporean, but in general, I feel like nation building or emphasizing on things like positive aspects of nation building as a form of national identity can often be conceived of as much more positive and allows for more positive much more positive view or much more positive framework for moving forward. And then obviously I think in the op you would argue that a view of nation building, specifically in the Balkans, is probably not a great idea because of the most recent history that's much more divisive, and then give reasons as to why such a divisive history is likely to make tensions much worse within the area. So broadly, that is kind of my thoughts. I don't know, Geneva or Jack, if you guys have anything to add, please jump in. No, you're gonna leave me here.
I think that was extremely comprehensive. If people on the stream have questions, they could be delivered. If not, we can probably call it a day.
So superb debrief. Very, very detailed.
Definitely.
Smashed it.
Thank you.